Love, Death, and Robots is back, and I am so flippin' happy right now. The first episode I wanted to tackle, analyze, talk about, and add some more insight to is my favorite episode of Volume 3, The Very Pulse of the Machine. Based on the original short story by Michael Swanwick, originally published in February of 1998. The OG short story, this puppy right here, is something that we're going to use as a reference to give you some more of that sweet context on this adaptation in Love, Death plus Robots. Oh, and some of you may know Michael Swanwick from his other work on Ice Age. You know, another Love, Death, and Robots episode. I will also point out that this show is forming a habit of depicting stories about two characters stuck in dry, barren landscapes accompanied by hallucinogenic glowing oceans of light. And another precursor to this video, because why not, is that some of you out there may be like, Bryce, why did you make a 13-minute long video to a 15-minute long episode? And my response to that would be the Mona Lisa is one painting, and it has 134 million search results on Google. So I'm assuming that art isn't surface level, and in this video we're going to the bottom of the iceberg. So if you're still going to comment about the length of the video and how it's unnecessary and too long, eat my shorts. Here's my literal shorts. Eat them. In The Very Pulse of the Machine, we follow Martha Kivelson, who, if you didn't know, is voiced by Mackenzie Davis, the sci-fi legend who played Yorkie in San Junipero, Mariette in Blade Runner 2049, Grace in whatever timeline of Terminator this is, and so on. Martha Kivelson over here is having the opposite of a good day. She's on an exploratory mission on a Jovian moon, Io, accompanied by her research partner, Juliette Burton. This scientific expedition is interrupted by a sulfur eruption that sends the rover flying and supposedly kills Burton. And just for purposes of preserving monetization and making sure there's no confusion with that, I will mention early on that Burton becomes a zombie. So she's not dead, she's a zombie. She's not dead. With the damaged suit that's running out of oxygen, Martha has no choice but to use the remaining oxygen in Burton's suit, burdening her with having to carry around her inactive body. Kill me. When carrying around Burton, Martha grabs some sulfur dioxide snow and packs it into Burton's helmet to hide her face. In the original short story, it's written that Burton had a classical education and a love of classical poets like Spencer and Ginsberg and Plath, which is why we see this book of poetry fall to the floor right here. This also explains why Io recites poetry using Burton's brain. And wait just a second, what is this? Michael Swanwick, the writer of the short story, wrote the book of poems that can be seen in this episode. Or it could just be a coincidence, who knows. Anyway, Martha is unable to make contact with Orbital, and she's 41 kilometers, or roughly 25 miles from the lander. In the original short story, before she takes the methamphetamine, or in this case, morphine, she had been awake for almost 22 hours and had been walking for roughly 7 hours straight. Martha needs a little something to keep going, so she gets a little lit, and I'm not referring to literature like the stuff in the book. Bringing us to the most asked question: is Burton talking to Martha a product of Io being a machine, or a product of unresolved psychological conflicts and drugs causing hallucinations? Great question. Me. Burton does start talking to Martha right after Martha takes the morphine. Also, some of the side effects of that injection are hallucinations and euphoria, which would definitely explain the hallucinations right here. But Burton talking to Martha may be an entirely separate thing. In fact, every time Martha comes out from these hallucinations, Burton is telling her to wake up, implying that they communicate when she's not experiencing the side effects. There is evidence suggesting that Io is actually communicating with Martha using Burton. Io's metallic core generates a magnetic field connecting its own poles with the poles of Jupiter. In the short story, Burton even claims that Jupiter's magnetosphere is the largest in the solar system. If the human eye could see it, it would appear 2.5 times wider in the sky than the sun does, which is pretty freaking impressive. The main element we see on Io is sulfur, which is triboelectric, and we've been hearing that word a lot, so like, what does that mean? Well, as someone who was kicked out of film school, I feel properly educated to tell you the meaning behind that. Kidding, I don't, but basically all you have to know is that if the sulfur is rubbing up against something like a piece of debris right here, it's going to create an electrical charge. Martha rubs some of that sulfur on Burton's helmet, allowing Io to use Burton's semi-intact brain as a superhighway into her mind. A a highway that becomes visible when Martha uses her helmet to show her the electrical charges within the sulfur plains. Flowing lines vein the warping wings of subterranean electromagnetic forces. Io is suspected to be a triboelectric alien device the size of Earth's moon. This machine was supposedly built eons ago by mobile intelligent life forms for some unknown purpose. And let me just check on something right here. Oh, yep. Okay, that's all the information we have on the history of Io. But something I do know is that Io found quotation easier than speech, which is why it starts quoting poetry. The first line of poetry Burren/Io recites is, "O sleep, it is a gentle thing, beloved from pole to pole," quoting part 5 of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge. In this story, the mariner stops some random wedding guest at a wedding, and then just starts telling him a story about how this one time his ship was brought out to the middle of the Arctic water, and then later the equator. During this very unfortunate voyage, the crew members encounter spirits that play games for their souls. This results in the entire crew getting killed off besides the mariner, turning it into an even more unfortunate journey. In part 5 of this poem, the one that Burren was quoting, the mariner falls asleep and dreams of rain, only to wake up and find out that his dream has become reality. In fact, the mariner spends the rest of the story unable to distinguish dreams from reality, a theme that is very present in the pulse of the machine as Martha struggles to determine what's a hallucination and what isn't. When you get to part 5 in this poem, the sailors at this point are all dead, but then they begin to rise from the dead. They even start speaking, just like you guessed it, Burton over here. The mariner hears a voice that describes to him how the moon and the seas are working together to guide the ship, just like how Burren/Io point out how the moon operates. Okay, enough about the commonalities. The second poem Burren/Io quotes is The Milky Way by Barbara Justeris Benson. I don't have too much to say about this poem other than its spectacular flow, and the use of it in this episode slaps harder than that moment the other day where I decided to add melted caramel to my butter pecan sundae. What a day that was. And the use of this line also further hints at the invisible electrical charges within the sulfur plains on Io. Then Burren comes in with poem number 3, quoting the end of Tea at the Palace of Hoon by Wallace Stevens. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself, and there I found myself more truly and more strange. This poem right here has been compared to the Freudian theory of how the unconscious mind has a much larger influence on the conscious mind than most people are aware of, alluding to the fact that the conscious mind is surface level. This ties in with the fact that Martha is having trouble determining whether or not Burren talking to her is a product of unresolved psychological conflicts. In the short story, Martha took home bronze in the 48 Olympics for women's marathon, and tied in second for the internationals in Kenya. She felt like she was always in third place, or at most fighting for second. Always flight crew, sometimes landing crew, but never the commander. Never class president, never king of the hill. Just once she wanted to be Neil Armstrong. Martha always felt as if she was inflating Burton's memories to the size of Io. Their fellow crew members would even say that she would magnify her friend to a godlike status in order to justify the fact that she always lost to Burton anytime they competed. Martha inflating Burton to this godlike status is something that's visually represented right here in the episode. So needless to say, Martha had a hard time with Burton, as she was naturally competitive and couldn't handle the fact that Burton was better at things than she was. So by this point, Martha was beyond just peanut butter and jealous of Burton, she was straight up envious. Martha didn't want to be left behind and suffered from an ego the size of Wyoming. In this episode, Martha passes these rock formations with people's bodies morphing in and out of them. And lucky for you, I can tell you that the short story definitely adds some more context to this imagery. Martha compares the faces in these rock formations to the play The Trojan Women, as well as Lot's wife from Genesis 19 in the Bible. All the women from these stories are tragic figures who had to flee their homes. The Trojan Women follows the stories of multiple women after their city known as Troy is burned to the ground and they are taken away from everyone that they loved. In Genesis 19 from the Bible, Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt while fleeing Sodom, perfectly matching the imagery of these stone structures right here. All of this implies that Martha views herself as a Trojan woman or a Lot's wife during that moment. When Martha finally sees the currents of information, Io recites a line from the poem She Was a Phantom of Delight by William Wordsworth. And now I see with eye serene the very pulse of the machine. Well, look at that, that's the title of the episode. A poem describing the narrator's first time seeing this one really beautiful woman, then going on to compare the woman to being close to a spirit or an apparition. The poem ends with, and yet a spirit still, and bright, with something of angelic light, strongly relating to how all the pathways converge on Burren's face right here. Then, right before Burren picks up Martha in the most epic way possible, Burren quotes Wordsworth again, "The marble index of a mind forever, voyaging through strange seas of thought, alone." This is from William's work known as The Prelude, a poem that comes from my favorite movement called the Romanticism movement. Like other writers like Henry David Thoreau and Lord Byron, Wordsworth had a huge fixation on returning to nature and finding peace and solace in that. I feel like this Lord Byron quote really sums up at least my understanding of what this movement is. "I love not man the less, but nature more." But enough about Byron, we're talking about the words of Wordsworth here. The Prelude is an autobiographical poem basically following Wordsworth throughout his life, focusing on things like him cherishing his solitude during his youth, as well as his ever-growing love for nature. Overall, it's about how important nature is to one's spiritual and intellectual development, really just promoting the idea, I'm gonna sneeze, really just promoting the idea of becoming one with nature. This is all very important, so make note of it. Martha arrives at a crater containing a black pool of molten sulfur. If she jumps in, Io would absorb her for a chance to duplicate her neural patterning and bring her back to life. In the short story, Io is incapable of physically interacting with the world, so short story Martha is the one to throw Burren over the edge. But in this episode, Burren/Io carries Martha to this point where it's up to her if she wants to jump over the edge. And Burren already jumped in. I kind of like the change that they made for this Love, Death, and Robots episode, as Burren was already connected with the moon. So it makes sense that Io could physically move Burren if Io is already able to talk through her. Io/Burren offers Martha eternal life. In the short story, Martha predicts that jumping into the sulfur is going to do one of two things. Either it could kill her and she would die, or she could utilize the millions of watts of power on Io to send out a signal that could reach Earth, or in this case, orbital. Option 2 is essentially what ends up happening. If Martha died, the hallucination would have ended when she entered the molten sulfur. So Martha did end up becoming one with Io, and was able to send out a message to orbital. The original short story Martha, as we all know by now, was very ego-driven and self-centered. Io claims that its primary function is to get to know her. So on Io, she feels a sense of belonging. She can understand herself while becoming part of something much bigger than she is. Martha's helmet breaks open the same way as Burren's, allowing Io to start preserving her neural configuration. Martha joins Io in this communion of the soul. Through this process, she experiences this cognitive enlightenment and spiritual development that can be symbolic of the same kind of awakening Wordsworth had gone through when he returned to nature. For those who are curious, I posted a link to the original short story in the description below. Subscribe for more of these Love, Death, and Robots videos, and thanks for watching, guys.